Imagine this. A young boy is watching porn. He's only 9 years old, but that's actually the average age of first exposure to porn. Since his parents hadn't talked to him about it yet, he didn't know any better. Over the next several years, his addiction progresses to the point where watching porn is all he ever does in his free time. Due to his lack of social interaction, he never learns how to respect women. Down the line, he gets a girlfriend, and they run into issues with their intimacy because of his addiction. Not only do they have problems with their intimacy, but neither of them knows that she contracted an STD from a previous relationship, leading to infertility. They seek medical help to figure out why they can't conceive, and they learn that she had contracted gonorrhea from her previous sexual relationship, which later developed into PID, pelvic inflammatory disease, causing her to be infertile. Some of you might be squirming in your seats right now, but I believe all of you are mature enough to handle this topic. You might also be wishing you were anywhere else but here. However, this topic is incredibly important. People are struggling to form loving and committed marriages. People are plagued with sexually transmitted diseases, and people are succumbing to lustful temptation. God's plan for sex has become increasingly broken in today's society, causing damage to young people's bodies and souls, and in turn, suffering for all of humanity. If you are like me and the idea that sex belongs only in a marriage has been drilled into your head since a young age, then you might be wondering why you need to hear a speech about it. Most Christians know what God's rules for sex are, but many non-believers won't accept "thou shalt not" as an argument. They need to have concrete reasons as motivation to care about God's rules for sex. Therefore, even Christians who are fully committed to sexual integrity still need to understand the full implications in order to educate others. Furthermore, Christians will still be tempted, and sometimes just being told, "don't do it," won't be enough because of our fallen nature. The potential risks of going outside God's plan go far beyond unwanted pregnancy and include physical and emotional pain, even lifelong pain. This pain affects men and women in different ways, but it does affect them both. The story I described earlier shows that while the physical implications are obvious, the psychological implications are hidden and even more profound. We cannot disconnect our bodies from our souls, just as God and his Son Jesus cannot be disconnected from the Holy Spirit. We are embodied souls. I first encountered this idea when I read the book Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey. Simply put, our souls and bodies are so completely intertwined that what we do to one of them will always affect the other. In today's speech, I will discuss God's plan for sex and how hookup culture completely ignores that plan. After that, I will explain the devastation caused by STDs and pornography. Lastly, I will explain how sex education is leading to more problems and what we can do about it. So, how did we get here? After all, God had a very specific plan in mind when he created sex. It is meant for marriage and marriage only. God's plan for sex is designed to propagate the human race. According to Nancy Pearcey, author of Love Thy Body, the fact that humans reproduce sexually is not some evolutionary fluke. It is part of the original creation that reveals the wonder and beauty of its creator. God created sex to be this incredibly powerful act with the specific purpose of creating more people to fill the earth. But it goes far beyond that. In my interview, I talked to Pam Stenzel, a dynamic abstinence-only lecturer who speaks at all kinds of events, ranging from high schools to pregnancy center banquets. But she particularly likes speaking at Christian schools because she can present God as the focus of her talks. She likes to start her speeches like this: God created sex. It's awesome. It was God's idea, not yours. God wants you to have great sex. He's not about wrecking your fun or ruining your weekend. This is where most people go wrong when talking about sex. Most Christian kids grow up thinking sex is this dirty, shameful thing that should never be done or even talked about. But that is not the truth. It is a wonderful thing in the right context. And what is that context? Marriage. The reason sex is intended to stay in the context of marriage, according to Sean McDowell, author of Chasing Love, is to help bond a man and his wife together for life. You may think God created sex just to be a fun activity between two people, or even just to make babies, but he intended it to be far more profound. Genesis 2:24 says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." This connection goes much deeper than just physical pleasure. However, since the sexual revolution in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, many people have decided that the context for intimacy is irrelevant, and casual sex on a whim should have no consequences. For example, the pill, which became widely available in the 1960s, removed responsibility for conception. Other forms of contraception existed throughout the centuries, but this oral medication was a game changer. Not only does it prevent ovulation, thereby preventing pregnancy, but women and doctors started noticing other uses: easing menstrual symptoms, clearing acne, and reducing the risk of other conditions. These other uses made the pill even more popular, and this new contraception led to the rise of hookup culture because women worried less about the physical consequences of pregnancy. Thus, hookup culture is different from sexual sins of the past, because while people once felt shame if they had sex outside of marriage, they now celebrate its freedom. In my interview with Pam Stenzel, she illustrated the effect of hookup culture on people. She used this analogy. It's like putting duct tape on your arm and then ripping it off. When you put it on somebody else's arm, you rip it off their arm, it'll stick a bit, but pretty soon it has no ability to stick anymore. The adhesive of the tape is our ability to emotionally connect to a person. God designed us to bond to one person, our husband or wife. Repeated shallow bonding through sexual intimacy with many different people reduces our ability to bond with a forever partner. Nancy Pearcey puts it eloquently. By repeatedly breaking up, or never connecting in the first place, many people fail to learn how to form the strong, resilient bonds needed to create happy, fulfilling, long-term marriages and families. If all of this evidence hasn't convinced you yet, listen to what the secular world is saying. Even many non-Christians agree that hooking up is emotionally unhealthy. In fact, according to the article, "Is Casual Sex Emotionally Healthy?" more than 50% of people surveyed regretted casual sex at least once, and findings indicated that many had felt embarrassment or other negative feelings about casual sex at some point. So now that we understand the current sexual environment, let's look more closely at some of the problems that women and men face. One of the biggest concerns for women who are sexually active must be STDs. Most people who have sex outside of marriage worry only about an unintended pregnancy, but don't realize the potential problems that STDs can bring. In fact, the effects of contracting a sexually transmitted disease are so profound that even people who aren't sexually active should be concerned. Of the many health concerns that come from STDs, cancer, death, or overall ill health to name a few, one of them, infertility, includes physical symptoms and societal symptoms. If a girl gets chlamydia once, for example, she has a 25% chance of being infertile. If she gets it twice, she has a 50% chance. And infertility has become a much bigger problem recently because, according to Pam Stenzel, infertility has risen over 500% among women in 10 years. Regardless of these health problems I've mentioned, many people believe that STIs, the infections that can lead to STDs, aren't a big concern because there are ways to treat them. Some STIs are viral and some are bacterial. The bacterial STIs are treatable, but the viral ones are not treatable. While symptoms of a viral STI can be managed, it is still a lifelong condition. And according to the CDC, many STIs have no symptoms. So people can have an infection but not know it. Now, how do sexually transmitted diseases affect people who are not sexually active? There are at least two non-sexual ways. One way is through financial burden. According to Sean McDowell, the US government spends billions per year on research and treatment for STDs. Quite obviously, this is an expense that everyone pays for, sexually active or not. Furthermore, the CDC reported more than 2.5 million cases of STDs in 2022. That's a lot of treatment dollars out of our pockets. Another societal effect is how the STD-related infertility can cause lower population growth. Lower population growth over time means fewer and fewer. Planet Earth could end up looking like it did in the beginning of WALL-E. STDs cause health and societal problems. As you'll see, pornography can contribute to these problems as well. Pornography isn't the same as having sex, and it can't give you STDs, so why then is it so bad? While pornography cannot give you STDs, and the viewer isn't actually engaged in sex, it still isn't the most innocent activity. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Looking at porn causes you to break the 7th commandment, even while you fool yourself into thinking you found a loophole. Now, designating porn as sinful would be a good enough answer for a Christian, but a non-believer needs more than just the 10 commandments. Thankfully, we have the reasons and research to back up God's law. Reasons include physical and mental effects such as altered brain chemistry or social isolation that come from watching pornography. The first of these effects, altered brain chemistry, dulls the pleasure response in the brain and leads to reduced gray matter. According to Nancy Pearcey, pornography has the addictive power it does because it floods the brain with dopamine. With repeated use, the brain becomes rewired to pursue more and more of it. Is it any wonder that people neglect their social connections and keep going back for more? Not only can one become addicted to porn, but Nancy Pearcey asserts that it shrinks the brain and reduces neural activity. This can mean that after time, the real thing won't be as exciting. This altered brain chemistry and depersonalized nature of porn can cause problems when making romantic connections. There are hormones in your brain that are meant to create a bond. And when you watch pornography, according to Professor of Psychology William Struthers, you're not being bound to a person. You're being bound to a representation of some person. You're being bound to the pornography. Now again, you might be wondering, how does this affect me if I don't watch porn? Porn's effect on individual people bleeds out into society, causing problems for everyone. To explain why, I am going to turn to the biblical teaching in Ephesians chapter 5, which describes marital relationships, including a wife's submission to her husband. Many people overlook verse 28, which says, "Husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself." This kind of love and commitment does not flow from husbands who watch porn because their view of women is completely distorted due to the artificial world it comes from. Because of this low view of women generated by porn, porn users are at a higher risk of divorce. According to Nancy Pearcey, the first longitudinal study on porn found that men who start watching porn after they marry are twice as likely to divorce. Clearly, porn disrupts God's plan in several different ways, by altering brain chemistry, by ruining bonds, and by corrupting men's view of women. One way we can lessen the problems from hookup culture, STDs, and pornography is through proper sex education. Sex education is an important part of God's plan because not only do young people need to know what God's plan is for sex, but also the dangers of stepping outside of his plan. However, the general emphasis of sex ed in schools is the mechanics or the biology, which is too narrow in focus and does not help a young person learn to consider the profound impact of something like sex on their life. This approach oversimplifies a very complex issue. According to Nancy Pearcey, sex education reduces the meaning of sex to a how-to manual. It is demoralizing to young people to suggest that the only instruction they need is how to use the drugs and devices for safe sex. Sex education reduces sex to a thing that's perfectly okay to do if you use proper protection without any mention of morality. Not only does the current sex education industry in most schools simplify sex, it also creates an atmosphere where teens feel pressure to become sexually active before they might normally. In one study, teens reported that they felt more pressure from their sex education classes than from their girlfriends or boyfriends. Sex education normalizes sex and gives kids information for which they have no context. So, how can we change sex education to better serve God's plan for humanity? Here are some things to consider. First, it is unrealistic to expect teens to refrain from sex merely because of religious doctrine. If sex education is well designed, it provides teens with more tools to make a good choice, or at the very least, know what they're getting themselves into. In Pam Stenzel's words, proper sex ed is not telling kids not to do something. Sex ed is giving them the truth and leaving the behavior up to them. This is where current sex ed goes wrong. The idea of safe sex creates an expectation that cannot be fulfilled. It's not possible. And as Pam Stenzel says, we don't teach kids how to sin safely. No matter how minor or insignificant a sin might seem, all sins threaten a soul's salvation. Teaching kids that they can have safe sex before marriage tears them away from God, because they start to think that with this worldly protection, they can have sex without consequences. While they might manage to avoid the physical consequences, they cannot avoid the spiritual ones. It is imperative that young people be given the truth about the consequences of stepping outside God's law. The primary responsibility for this rests on the parents. In Paul David Tripp's book, Age of Opportunity, as he refers to Deuteronomy 6, he says, "The family is God's primary learning community. Parents have a platform for instruction that no one else has. The family is radically different from the classroom as a setting for learning." Because the family is primary, sex, one of the most important aspects of God's plan, should be discussed in this context. Parents know their children better than any teacher could and have the most significant impact on their thoughts and behaviors. They can also adjust the information to better suit their children. Therefore, sex education should be left primarily to the parents, who give their kids as much information as they can, but who leave the moral decision up to their children. Because ultimately, the children will face the consequences of their actions, not the parents. I just threw a lot of information at you, and you might be wondering what you should do with it. Both teens and parents have responsibilities. Parents, start by asking your kids if they have any questions or concerns to get the conversation started. I know it sounds crazy, but much of the problems with sex today come simply from a lack of knowledge. Also, I would recommend placing restrictions on your kids, regardless of whether you think they watch porn or not. One option is services, such as Covenant Eyes, Canopy, or even Bark. While you do have to pay for these, they are a great option. However, there are still options that don't involve a subscription. All Apple devices, and most others, have parental controls that you can customize to fit your needs. As another layer of protection, many Wi-Fi routers actually have parental controls built into them. For example, my family uses Google Home, where you can filter what your kids see on the internet. Teens, your job is to be open to what your parents have to say. You should also ask for help. We are all sinful human beings who cannot make it through life alone. You will need help from your parents or a trusted friend. Finally, while these rules and restrictions we put in place will help, we ultimately need to call upon God's strength and grace, parents and kids alike, to bear His image well. Saving sex until marriage may make you feel alone or out of place in society, but it is well worth it when you bond with your forever partner. Thank you.
Great job, Poppy. Do we have any questions for her?
Good job, by the way. But what would you say about the relationship between pornography consumption and like the increase of violence, even within relationships, i.e., like watching porn that normalizes violence toward your partner?
That's a great question. I'm so glad you asked because I actually wanted to address that in my speech, but I didn't have enough time. It definitely can, pornography can definitely lead to more abusive relationships because of the nature of most pornography. It normalizes that kind of violence in that relationship, so it definitely can lead to more abuse.
Great job, Poppy. My question is addressing the conclusion, more or less, of what would you say to a peer who does not feel comfortable talking about sex with their parents?
That's a tough question, but it is very important. I would recommend finding a other trusted adult that you do feel comfortable with, or even maybe an older sibling or an older friend that you trust and you know that they have good intentions for you. Since, if you don't feel comfortable with your parents, then that would be another good option.
Other questions? Okay, great job, Poppy.